So first of all, welcome to the City Council. This afternoon, some of you know we have a special City Council meeting this afternoon at 4 o'clock. And so we took the chance today, while we had everybody here, to sort of talk about an issue that's been perplexing Albuquerque for a really long time. I mean, it has been frustrating for all of us that over the past few years, we've watched Albuquerque and our police department make real progress on things like auto theft and property crime, while the issue of gun violence just continues to plague us. And it's frustrating, as I'll say for me, and I'm sure for the rest of us, as local leaders. For a long time, we've heard that prohibitions on the cities enacting gun laws that we know would work, or gun safe legislation, sort of meant that the city can't take any action at all. Well, quite frankly, we're tired of waiting on Santa Fe and Washington to step up and do something. And we're living with our constituents every day who are worried about this. And so a few weeks ago, the three of us held a town hall with some of our legislators and some of our colleagues to really take a look at what pieces of legislation might help change Albuquerque from a policy standpoint to make our city safer while we're waiting on those folks in Santa Fe and DC to do their job. And so today we're going to introduce a package of new legislation, 3 pieces of legislation, and I'll let the other councilors start with theirs. But in essence, we have 3 pieces of legislation today. One is a very basic amendment to legislation that's already on the books in Albuquerque. In 2015, our council passed a legislation that I helped draft that basically said it's illegal to threaten a school shooting online. It turns out that in New Mexico, it's not technically illegal to threaten a mass shooting or mass violence unless you do it by telephone with a bomb threat, because our laws about threats were written decades ago when that was the most serious crime. And so here in Albuquerque, we passed a new law that said that if you threaten a school online, then APD has the ability to investigate. And they've used that 5 times in the first year alone to investigate threatened school shootings. This amendment will expand that protection to other public places. And so if we look at what happened, say, in Walmart in El Paso, we don't want that to happen here in Albuquerque. And that First Amendment would allow us to apply those same mass violence threats protections to every public place in Albuquerque, so that in an age like this, when blogs and somebody can post a threat online and in a few minutes take action to enact it, we don't want those minutes to tick by while APD is waiting on the feds to sort of step up and help us figure that out. So that's one, is a threat against mass violence anywhere in the city of Albuquerque would now become a crime. Number 2 would be a ban on firearms in city meetings and city facilities where people do business, including our libraries, city council meetings. We'll talk a little more about why we think that's important, but common sense tells us that in a place where you have to get your permits and you get to file your grievances and act out against them, against your neighbors and the government, the gun shouldn't be part of that process. And the last is new legislation that says if you're a gun owner in the city of Albuquerque and you leave your gun, we want you to leave it in a way that others can't pick it up or take it. And that means that kids can't take them. And just like we saw in Rio Rancho earlier this year, where a student took his dad's gun from home, took it to school and shot at several students, we want gun owners to think about when they walk away from their gun, whether it's at home or in their car, we want them to think about how they can safely secure that so that other folks can't get access to it. Those are the 3 pieces of legislation, but I really want to let my colleagues, Councilor Benton and Councilor Gibson, take a first stab at talking a little bit about the proposed ban on firearms in public facilities.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. So public facilities, public government, local government, that's where we go for our most basic necessities of getting a building permit or getting a picnic permit, coming down to petition our city leaders, whether it's the councilors or the mayor or a department head, about immediate needs that we have. A place where we have a public forum at the city council, the only real public forum outside of the county commission for the average citizen to speak and to be heard. There's no alternative to going to these places. And a person who has these needs should be able to attend that facility, speak with those public officials at whatever level, and have their needs addressed. The idea that somebody, as was mentioned, some of these things have sensitive qualifications having to do with neighbor to neighbor. issues, zoning, a complaint about something in your neighborhood, weed and litter, you name it. You name it, but these are sometimes sensitive. We're certainly not saying people should not be able to have their open carry weapons, but in these situations, it's my belief that that adds an element of restraint and a question as to whether a person can really be served by their local government. And that's why we went to where places where public business is being conducted to not allow the weapons.
Okay,
Thanks, Jim, sorry. I want to say, Councilor Gibson's really been a champion on this and has really been looking at this issue for a really long
Yes.
time, about how the city can step up and take action that protect our community. And I want to give her credit for really leading that effort here at the city. We're sort of here because of a lot of the groundwork she laid on this for years.
yeah, it wasn't successful, but.
The agony of defeat.
The agony of defeat. But we sure gave it a go. So this particular bill, this ordinance, starts out by talking about listing several very unfortunate events that resulted in loss of life or extreme injury to people as a result of the use of firearms in public venues, in municipal buildings throughout the United States. And, you know, they all tell the same story that we've all heard over and over again. Virtually all local governments are receiving threats, you know, besides this, threats which may have some basis and some are just empty threats. But what it does is it creates fear and you know, distrust, and so we find that people are less enthusiastic about coming out to a city council meeting or a county commission meeting or going to a public forum where they can talk about something that's really important to them, you know. And as Councilor Benton already mentioned, that many of these gatherings do evoke a lot of emotions. You know, people are very passionate about the property that they own, the land use that is available to them, or might they have the perception that it's threatening them around them. So it's already a highly charged situation in many of these venues, and but you know, we want to invite people to come. And so the way I look at this is that this bill actually does two things. It recognizes the obligation that the city of Albuquerque has to its employees, contractors, to provide as safe an environment and do that with such care as we can, and also to the people, residents, and the businesses that we represent here in Albuquerque. We do not want any of the people that we're representing to be shortchanged, to have to forego an opportunity to raise an issue or address a challenge that they may see. So I think that this ordinance does a good job. There's no silver bullet here. You know, we just have to do what we can do.
Thanks. And then, of course, we have two other pieces of legislation that we sort of talked about, but I think it's probably easier just to take questions about how we apply those, or what do you want to talk about? So let's just do that, if that's okay.
Okay, let's
Start from, yeah, hey,
yeah, hey, sorry, we're a little late.
you're good.
Okay, so let's talk about the aspect about the taking the guns and holding people liable for where they put them, right?
Storage, yeah.
Storage, yeah.
Yep.
So how is that gonna work in terms of like, are people gonna be required to have gun locks, gun store, like, what does that mean?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the pieces of this legislation is responsible gun storage by responsible gun owners. And like, in the city of Albuquerque last year, we had more than 1,000 guns stolen from automobiles. The guns were just left unattended in cars. We had hundreds more stolen from home burglaries, for example. And those end up on our streets and made accessible to people, and part of the challenge of us trying to deal with gun violence in this city. That's a solution we can solve. And so part of our town halls a few weeks ago, looking at solutions that worked in other cities, we found that places like the entire state of Massachusetts, Iowa, parts of North Dakota, and California have lowered gun violence by ensuring that gun owners are required to be responsible. It doesn't infringe on your right to, we're not making a decision about who owns a gun, we're not making a decision about how you carry it. But when you lay a gun down and walk away, we want to be sure that it's not accessible for a kid who can use it, someone who commits suicide, or for a bad guy who can see it as a target to take. And what we know is that as you talk to auto burglary victims in the city and you look on a map and see 5 or 6 auto burglaries neighbor to neighbor over time where nothing is taken, what we know is auto burglars now know that enough guns are available and they're looking for those. And we want to remove that opportunity. So it kind of goes like this. If you're leaving at home at the end of the night, take your gun in and lock it up. And if you're leaving your gun on vacation or you're leaving your home, secure it so even if somebody's there, they don't have access to it. And worse, we've seen real situations like the school shooter in Rio Rancho recently who accessed his family's gun that was not secure. We don't want that sort of to happen and replicate itself here in Albuquerque. And so this is saying that if you're going to be a gun owner in Albuquerque, we want you to just be responsible when you walk away from your gun.
What are the penalties for that?
All of these are misdemeanors. That's a great, thanks, Paul.
No.
All of these are misdemeanors, which is important for 2 reasons. One, under state law, that's the highest penalty the city can give. But more important, these are not penalties that would, by law, give you a felony that would prohibit you from using a firearm in the future. We're saying that by committing these crimes or by following these rules, at worst, you'll get a misdemeanor so that we can work with you to sort of ensure compliance in the future. And better yet, on the safe storage procedure, you can get a gun lock from APD for free today. They're available. I bought a couple this morning at Sportsman's Warehouse for less than $10 that would comply with this law, so they're accessible to anybody. And more important, in this legislation is a provision that says the city and the court can dismiss it if you just simply go buy a gun lock for the future. And so we're really trying to do compliance instead of punishment, but it's an important conversation, especially when we get into the piece about where you can and can take your weapons in a public forum, because data is now showing us that 47% of Hispanics, for example, say they're fearful of going to a public place because they're scared of a mass shooting. Well, those are people we need in our public discussions in the city, and so we're trying to take those steps based on science to ensure that everybody gets to participate.
Enforcement, how do you get caught for something like that?
Yeah, there's no provision that APD is going to knock on everybody's door and check their guns. What we do know is if your gun is used in the commission of a crime, we want APD to figure out how it was that it ended up on the street. And if you weren't being responsible, if you left it accessible to a child who used it in a school or something worse, we have the ability to go back and hold that gun owner accountable. But again, we're also including provisions that say we'll dismiss those charges or won't charge you if you can come into compliance and to ensure that the next time you have a gun, it's in a safer place. Andy?
You talked about car break-ins, so just so I'm clear, if it's locked in your car, does not comply with this?
Currently, it would not comply with the law to simply be locked in your car. And we know that's just too accessible, honestly, for auto theft. But it means that if it's in your car, it just needs to be secured so it can't be operable. And that means by some gun lock that the bad guy can't necessarily defeat right away. And that really does make it less enticing because you can't sell a gun on the street that doesn't shoot bullets. And so by simply securing your weapon, even in an extra, say a gun vault or gun lock, or even in the glove box with a key, a way that keeps some extra layer of security. So laying on the floor, it's not easily visible and accessible to a bad guy. That's a very simple way to help people accountable.
The public places aspect of it, the first kind of leg of it, we mentioned the El Paso, what happened in El Paso as an example of why you guys want to do this, and that happened in a Walmart, right? So
This would not apply to that.
Okay,
Well, the mass threats ordinance would apply to that. Is
Yeah.
that the one you're talking about?
Yeah,
If
just so break
somebody-
it down for me, like what is gonna apply to this new ordinance? Yeah,
Yeah, so there is an ordinance currently on the books in Albuquerque that says you can't threaten a mass shooting in a school. We passed that because there's no state law that makes that illegal, correctly enough. This would expand that same school threat ordinance to everywhere else. And what that really means is if a person goes on Facebook or Instagram or some online chat and threatens to shoot a place in Albuquerque, APD can respond, investigate, find out where that shooter is through Facebook or elsewhere, and don't have to wait on the FBI. In those critical moments of picking up the phone, calling somebody in DC, can make all the difference in a shooting. And so we're just extending the same protection our students have in public school today to everywhere else in the city of Albuquerque. The other legislation that the other counselors are helping on applies only to public buildings.
at public.
How do you,
Well, parks too, I mean, parks, pools, I guess, like any city-owned facility, right?
It's, the way it's written is where public business is being conducted, so that would probably not apply to just a recreational facility.
So I could take my gun to Summerfest?
If you're on the public street, there's no prohibition against that, right? You can openly carry that now in New Mexico. But that's not a city facility, but I think what Councilor Ben is saying is just visiting a city park, if there's no public event happening, if the city's not doing an after-school program there, that sort of thing, then I think,
Yeah.
and that's one of the conversations we ought to have.
Yeah, maybe this needs to be discussed further, but the idea is where commonplace public interactions, so coming to a city council meeting to speak publicly or to, like I said, just an example of getting a building permit or something like that.
going back to enforcement, if somebody showed up to a city council meeting with a concealed carry license, you may never know, how do you enforce something like that? Are you checking people or?
At the end of the day, once we have this, at the end of the day, let me be clear, and you know this, Andy, because we talked about this earlier, but like to paint this picture, and if those of you who cover city council know this, it is perfectly legal for a person to walk into the city council chambers in the middle of a meeting with an AR-15, and it is illegal for a police officer to stop them, question them, or ask them why until they start shooting. And we don't believe that that prohibition in the Constitution was ever intended to keep us from keeping that meeting safe by asking a simple question. And so if we pass this legislation, when we pass this legislation, we'll work out the rules with the police department and city security to figure out how to enforce that best, and we're gonna let the professionals decide how to do that. But at the moment, we can't even ask somebody why they're carrying an AR-15 and 100 rounds of ammunition into our city council meeting. And that to us seems just absolutely absurd.
Seems like
Although we can prohibit other things, everything from a spit wad to a machete, but we cannot prohibit firearms.
So some naysayers may point to the roundhouse, that's one of the things they talk about
Yeah.
almost every year, is that you can, especially on Second Amendment days, that
Yep.
everyone brings their guns in. What do you say to that when they look at the city council compared to the roundhouse?
Well, the legislature has the ability, as you know, Andy, in the rules, the legislature has the ability to, let me tell that to shut up. The legislature has the ability in their own rules to decide when and where somebody can carry firearms there, and they've had that discussion before. We believe we should have the same ability to make that decision for our own meetings. And again, sort of the common misconception, I think, or misinterpretation has been that for 30 years, that limitation in the state law that says cities can't pass any gun legislation whatsoever was never intended to place an individual's like desire to carry a assault rifle above everybody else's right to feel safe. And no city in 30 years has ever even challenged that provision. And we think the body of evidence and the current state of affairs gives us a lot of reason to set our own rules. We don't believe this infringes on that right to own a weapon. We're not deciding who can. This is something that it's time for us to do for our people in the city of Albuquerque. And if we get challenged, we've worked with our city attorney's office and with legal. We believe we have a defendable case, and we're willing to take it as far as we have to do in order to keep our city safe.
Could this expand to public thing like movies in the park or Summerfest or to public places? Could you, once this passes, should this pass, expand it to city functions?
Well, we can have that discussion as part of this debate, but again, at least my original intent was having to do with everyday daily business, not choosing to attend a public recreational event necessarily, but when you're doing a public business with a city-sponsored program of some sort, not just general recreation, that was what I certainly have in mind.
So I think a good example of that is a few years ago, we were doing public meetings up and down Central.
Mhm.
And started off, I think, at the Highland Theater. So if we were to do that after the passage of this ordinance, then yes, that would carry over to the Highland or any other place that the city was controlling at the time for the purpose of a public meeting.
And and I think the difference, it's important to talk, we'll talk about this more through these hearings, but I do think the important difference that Councilor Benton made earlier is this is not like choosing between Walmart and Kmart, that Walmart allows guns and Kmart doesn't, and so I have a choice to go somewhere else to buy the same widget. Everyone is required to do business with the city, and there's only one place and one time to do some of those things. And so we want to be sure that everybody feels welcome, that no one is bullied or out of fear is not able to access their government for whatever their reason, good, bad, or ugly. And so we want to make that accessible. There's nothing in the law that says that, leaving your gun aside for a few minutes to come in and get a permit or to speak to your city councilor has nothing to do with making a decision about who owns a gun in the state of New Mexico. We're simply saying at this time and place, there's something special about this public forum.
The legislation mentions a couple of instances at city council meetings. Could you elaborate on those?
I think it was before you were here, but I remember one at finance committee meeting in this room. In fact, we had a guy, active shooter threat, who came in into the treasurer's office in 2016 that was believed to have a weapon. We had a big city lockdown based on that. As it turned out, it was a behavioral health issue. But nonetheless, it really challenged us because we had city councilors, members of the public were here, and anybody could literally walk in from outside without any kind of protection. And I think that really highlighted for me, sitting here in this room, how dangerous that could be, because we didn't know whether that shooter was sitting here in our room or just down the hall. And quite frankly, it can be very concerning, and it delayed the business of the city. And sometimes that can cost us millions of dollars if we have to delay bond payments or financing pieces. There's just a lot at stake for the public.
Realistically, what are the chances of this getting support from the other councilors and actually getting through it?
I think that's why we want to have this conversation. Look, I think each of us individually at some point or another has been in a situation, whether it's a town hall meeting in our district, a city council meeting, a committee meeting, where we felt uncomfortable with someone and something there and wished we had a different option. And so I'm encouraged by personally, and I'm interested in my colleagues, but I feel pretty good about our ability to move forward in setting some reasonable limits on firearms in that hostile forum like the Councilor Benton mentioned. When it comes to those other things, we're not naive. We've been down this road before. We've already gotten emails based on the Journal's early story from folks that are already misrepresenting the facts, and we have to trust the media and the public to help us. This isn't making a decision about who owns a weapon. We're simply saying if you own one, be responsible with it. If you want to bring it to a public place, please be respectful of other people's concerns and leave everybody on an even playing field. I think those kind of values, if we stick to it, give us a real good chance of doing that. But at the same time, we've also heard from other cities around the state. When I was at the Municipal League a couple of weeks ago, this is a conversation that comes up time and time again. Why can't cities step up and make our decisions about what keeps us safe? And I think we're saying that as the city of Albuquerque, as leaders in our city, we're willing to challenge that old preconception that we can't do anything about it because we don't think that's true.
Is there or was there a law, state law, that municipalities can't legislate with respect to guns?
The law, well, Councilor Gibson should she addressed that with the bill that we referred to earlier, where she was wanting to assert local authority, or at least ask the legislature to consider that issue. So,
And that's what it was, the effort that we had several years ago, not sure what year it was now, was just simply to urge the state legislature to to allow cities and municipalities throughout the entire state to enact whatever firearm related legislation that they wish to do. So it's not prescriptive at all. Obviously, nobody can pass anything that would supersede the state or the federal level. But, something that's, something like what we're talking about here today, the three
Yeah,
things that we're
so-
talking about today.
We're not prohibiting weapons.
No.
We're not proposing that any prohibition on weapons. We're proposing certain standards of where a weapon can be carried and where it may be, how it must be stored responsibly.
And specifically to your answer, Jim, in 1986, voters passed a constitutional amendment in New Mexico that said only the state can pass gun laws, and it restricted a city's ability to pass those. But in 30 years, it's never been challenged, and so we believe that it was not intended again to let somebody walk into a meeting and start shooting before you can do something about it. There's a reasonable standard of what we can do there, and we intend to set the case law and make that happen.